Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I welcome you all to a webinar today on mainstreaming, scaling, and funder organizations, the experience of GIZ. GIZ is the German Agency of International Cooperation. I'm sure you knew that, but I just want to be sure you are aware of it. So, my name is Johannes Lin, and I serve as the co-chair of the Scaling Community Practice. Larry Cooley and I, Larry is also, by the way, on this call. Larry Cooley and I founded the Scaling Community Practice about 8 years ago. And by now it brings together almost 3,000 development experts and practitioners to exchange experience and lessons about how best to sustainably scale successful development interventions. In our recent annual workshop, which maybe some of you participated in, we launched a new initiative which is designed to study and advance the mainstreaming of scaling in funder organizations. While, of course, ultimately scaling has to be done by the actors on the ground, that's the governments, private business, social enterprise, and so on. Funders actually have an important opportunity, and I would say responsibility, to support scaling rather than to hinder it, as they may well have done too many times in the past. Now, under this initiative, we expect to work with some 10 international development funder organizations to learn from their experience with mainstreaming scaling into their approach to funding, and we hope to share that with the scaling community and, of course, the funder community at large. Among these 10 funders is GIZ, which has been a strong supporter of the scaling community practice from its beginning. And GIZ has long indeed focused on scaling and recently reviewed its approach to support scaling. Today, we will have this opportunity to hear from GIZ about the results of this review and to explore its implications with a number of outstanding panelists. This webinar is the first in what we expect to be a series of webinars showcasing the experience of our funder partners with scaling. And in fact, on April 19, we will host a second webinar at which Catholic Relief Services, or CRS, will present some of his experience with scaling. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our panel of excellent speakers. First of all, we have with us Arlet Stojanovic. Arlet, you are the head of innovation, knowledge sharing, and learning at GIZ. Arlet has over 20 years of project management and technical consulting experience in Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. Your focus areas are public sector innovation and digital governance. You and your colleague, Mara Holzenthal, who I believe cannot be with us today, you oversee GIZ's work on mainstreaming scaling. You will introduce the topic of scaling at GIZ and comment on the way forward for mainstreaming. Next, we have Richard Cole. Richard is the founder of the Center for Large-Scale Social Change, LLC. And Richard, you are, from my perspective, a scaling expert par excellence. Over the last 20 years, you've worked with many funding and implementing agencies on their scaling efforts. You've been a key supporter of the scaling community practice, and you've contributed a number of important COP community practice reports that are found on our website, and the website is www.scalingcommunitypractice.com. On this website, you, the participants, will find Richard's background paper for our mainstreaming initiative. Richard also has served as a consultant to GIZ in preparing the review that we'll hear about of GIZ's approach on scaling, and Richard will report on his finding. Richard lives on the US West Coast, where it's still very early, and we're especially grateful to you, Richard, for getting out of bed early today. Now, next is my special pleasure to introduce Bishnu Datta Gautam. Bishnu is former Joint Secretary for Planning and Development Assistance in the Ministry of Federal Affairs and General Administration of Nepal. Bishnu has many years of hands-on and senior leadership experience with special focus on developing and strengthening the role of local authorities in Nepal. Vishnu, you have worked closely with GIZ and other funders, and you will share your experience on how GIZ has supported scaling in Nepal. You join us from Kathmandu, Nepal, where it is evening now, and we're very grateful to you for connecting with us this late in your day. I also, in this connection, want to thank Sabrina Storm. I think Sabrina is on the call. Sabrina used to accompany the Scaling Community Practice on behalf of GIZ before moving to a new position in Kathmandu. Sabrina, was instrumental in getting Vishnu to join us today. So thank you, dear Sabrina. Next, we have with us Benjamin Kumpf. Ben currently serves as the head of OECD's Innovation for Development Facility. In previous positions, you served as lead on innovation at UNDP in New York City and at DFID, now known as FCDO, in the UK. You've been involved with the Scaling Community Practice for many years, and you're now actively engaged with us in the Mainstreaming Initiative. We understand that you and your colleagues at the Development Assistance Committee, or DAC, at OECD will promote more systematic support for scaling by the DAC members, that is, by the bilateral official donors that cooperate under the DAC umbrella. You, Ben, will share with us your experience and your perspective on scaling and on the experience specifically of GIZ. Finally, by way of introduction, it's my special pleasure to introduce Larry Cooley, who is the my co-chair of the Scaling Community Practice. Larry, you have a long career in development analysis and advice. You're the founder and president emeritus of Management Systems International, also known as MSI, a well-known international development consulting firm. You've been working on the scaling issues for about 20 years and advised many funders and implementing organizations. And it's been a special pleasure for me personally to be working closely with you on this important matter. You will share with us your closing observations and takeaways at the end of the webinar. So I expect we'll have a lively discussion among and with the speakers today, and I hope all of you on this call will participate by putting your questions and comments in the chat box, which should be accessible at the top of your screens. Panelists can choose, if you wish, to answer directly in the chat, or I will convey the comments and questions of the audience to the panelists verbally during the discussion segment of this webinar. I should also mention that we're recording this because it's, in our experience, it's very helpful that we can put recordings of these webinars that we organize on our website to have them accessible to an even larger community of experts and practitioners out there. With this, let me hand over the microphone and camera to you, Arlette. Please introduce the scaling topic for GIZ, and we're all yours. Thank you so much for being with us today. Over to you, Arlette.
Thank you very much, Johannes. And thank you for the invitation to this illustrious group. And, you know, we can just see ping, 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 how people are still joining. And I mean, if you look at the numbers of the community, it's very impressive, really. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share our findings and our thoughts. And, you know, I was thinking, because you are the community of practice, that maybe what I would start with an example of my own experience. And when I was thinking what is kind of my favorite result, maybe I should call it, in terms of scaling. It was when I was a program manager working for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in Bosnia, on the local level on a public administration reform project. And we introduced minimum standards in public finance and human resource management in 103 of 140 municipalities. And that was my first experience, really, where, you know, an approach really made a systematic difference in the way how things were done, in, you know, starting in that project, but actually in the change that was created in the country. So, but I'm here to talk about GIZ. And as Johannes already mentioned at the beginning, GIZ is quite a big international development cooperation organization working in 120 countries, having annually, our annual turnover currently is around 4 billion euro. So I'm just mentioning this because I think in terms of scale, I mean, in terms of size, it's a really huge organization. And the sad matter, I mean, if we are, I mean, we can speak bluntly here, is I don't think we are using that potential in terms of scaling at all at the moment. So, I mean, in terms of organizational setup, we have in the organization one unit that is kind of an internal service provider, a technical department that is there for the design of project and also advising on the implementation of projects. And there is one unit that I'm heading that is also responsible for the topic of scaling. And both me and Mara came new into this unit like a year and a half ago. And we've seen at that time, Sabrina was here. We've seen, of course, you know, the reports and guidelines and instruments that have been developed before. But we thought since we are both new here, I mean, no, not so new anymore, but that it's basically a good occasion to take a fresh look at the topic of scaling. And this is when we hired or actually started our cooperation with Richard, because what we wanted to look at was basically, you know, getting a fresh look at what is the status of scaling in the organization? How does it look with, you know, for somebody who has also an unbiased external view? What are impediments? You know, where are we good? Where are we not so good? What are factors that we could maybe influence to improve the whole discussion around scalings? Are there concrete recommendations, both, you know, for the organizational level, but also to us as a team working on that subject? Yeah. So basically, that was the framing we had, Johannes, and I think with that we are handing over to Richard. Or I don't know.
Richard,
you decide.
your turn. Yes, indeed. Go ahead, Richard. Thank you, Arlette, for the introduction. That was great.
Thank you, Arlette. Thank you, Johannes and Barry, for inviting me to do this. I have to say it's been a real pleasure working with Arlette and Mara and the GIZ team. There has been an honesty and a willingness to look at how things are that has really been refreshing. So, as Arlette just said, that what I was asked to do was, Arlette didn't mention, but I did want to say that GIZ has been one of the few donor or funding organizations that has been proactively working on scaling now for almost a decade. In around 2013, the GIZ commissioned an internal review of their scaling work to date, which both highlighted some accomplishments, but also some challenges. And since then, there has been the development of the unit that Arlette heads and that Mara is part of, as well as the development of a general approach and some tools and guidance documents. And at least to the best of my knowledge, there are not very many other bilateral, multilateral organizations that have that kind of a framework, guidance, and tools. I think, as we'll discuss, the journey is incomplete and there's more to be done. But I just want to signal to everyone who's not familiar with the work at GIZ that they have already been working on this for a decade and taken some important steps. As you can see from the slide and what Arlette just said, my mandate was to both look at what's going on with scaling in general, especially since 2013, and what could be done to increase the amount of scaling that's going on, and particularly at what role Arlette and Mara's unit can play in providing support to the rest of the staff. In order to achieve that, I was able to review all the documents that were relevant, or many documents that were relevant, as well as interview a number of staff from different divisions and directorates, not only in Germany, but also field staff. I would say that I did not have a chance to or systematically review projects or other efforts where scaling has been occurring, but so this is sort of a representative sample, which I hope does indicate what's going on, but it is qualitative and selected, not comprehensive. Okay. So, like many organizations, despite the fact, what I said a minute ago, that GIZ does have a framework and some guidance tools, there isn't an explicit mandate or organizational objectives for how much scaling should occur or what the targets are for scaling. And I want to note that I'm using scaling, and was used for this review, as defined as sustainable impact at large scale. Large scale being defined as something approaching national scale, or at least a significant percentage of the size of the problem. I think that the efforts that have gone on over the last 10 years, a lot of internal conversations and awareness building, has meant that most of the GIS that I talked to, perhaps a biased sample, are aware of the importance of scaling and do want to do something about it, but it's not clear what that means in practice for them, and I'll come back to that in a minute. There is, as far as I could tell, anecdotally, a lot of scaling going on at GIZ, but it's hard to know how much because it's not being systematically tracked. And most of what happens seems to be, like in many organizations, ad hoc or opportunistic. In other words, they're on a case-by-case, country-by-country, project-by-project case. There are many projects sooner or later do seem to go to scale, but it isn't clear how many. And the majority of those that seem to be happening are follow-up projects from initial projects. I should mention that GIZ also does what are called global projects internally, which are multi-country projects. So by definition, there is some cross-country scaling going on there, but it's, even in those projects, it often tends to be the case, highly variable, that each project is defined specifically for that, or the contents of the intervention is defined specifically in that country. In some of the global projects, there is a fair bit of sharing and standardization or replication of good practices, and in others that doesn't occur as much. And as part of that, GIZ is working hard as we speak, and perhaps Arlette could talk about this later, because I know she's involved with this, to create more standardization, not standardization as if everything is done the same, but this cross-country learning, to create, you know, what did we find out here, and how can the learning from this particular country or project be replicated in other countries, or future projects obviously being customized or adapted to that project, and also digitalization. I think one of the real strengths of GIZ is that the organization, when it designs projects, uses this concept of broad impact. And I think broad impact is quite helpful in scaling. It's very much aligned with the principles of scaling that the community of practice has adopted. It focuses on 4 factors: quantity, quality, relevance, and sustainability. And I think that my finding is that relevance is very strong. It's very much a emphasis at GIZ to talk to local stakeholders of all levels, and in terms of breadth and depth, not just people in the ministries or senior levels, but very much in the field, very much not just public sector, even though almost all GIZ projects partner very closely with one or more government ministries, and are in fact negotiated by GIZ's partner or sister organization, BMZ. BMZ sort of manages that relationship, and then GIZ, for those who don't know, actually implement the projects. And once that agreement is set on what the goals of a project will be, GIZ works very closely to understand in detail what that means for individual stakeholders, NGOs, civil society, public sector, both at the national level and at the local level. And there's also a very strong emphasis on sustainability, multidimensional. That said, and that being a very good foundation for scaling, My sense of what happens on the ground is that to some extent of the four factors, relevance is often seen as the most important. There's a very strong emphasis on, I think, a sort of a counteraction to "we know best in Germany," to no, we really need to make sure that local actors know best, and that it has to be relevant to local context. We're not going to come in with some cookie cutter thing developed by expertise in the global north and tell people in the global south how to do it. Quite the contrary. A real emphasis on local context, local relevance, local factors, and that's wonderful. But to the great extent that the more things are customized locally, this can make it challenging both to scale sometimes and also to replicate to other countries. And my sense is that, in fact, of the four factors, quantity, in other words, what scale you reach, is perhaps in many cases the least important, as composed to impact, relevance, and sustainability. And it's certainly not for me to make choices either for GIZ or for any individual GIZ project on how to balance that. But I think if GIZ is interested in achieving more scale, then taking a hard look and being a little bit more explicit about what those trade-offs are might be worthwhile and recommended. Similarly, and this is like many funders and donors, well actually GIZ is really more of an implementer than strictly a donor, which is BMZ. Scaling, it tends not to be built into projects. There isn't usually a sense, especially even of projects that are not global projects, that we might anticipate scaling in a second or a third or a follow-up project, and scaling is not built in, therefore, from the beginning in terms of if this were to go to scale on a follow-up project, is it in terms of its costs or its implementation requirements something that could be done with local resources, not just financially, but institutional capabilities at a larger scale. And so as a result, when follow-up projects do occur, they often have to take a substantial amount of time to grapple with those issues, the very issues I just indicated. Is this something that the national government, because GIZ does focus heavily on sustainability, whereas for the initial project, sustainability was meant in terms of, well, we've done this in 2 districts, can it continue to be done in 2 districts? Now it has to look at the question of what are the constraints systematic at the systems level, usually often at the national level, in terms of whether this can be done nationally. Are there national resources in terms of fiscal constraints for funding, implementation capacity, etc.? And often that requires substantial times for redesign, simplification, additional scans, etc. A second factor is because projects are not designed for scale, often in the negotiations between BMZ and the national government, there's a lot of objectives or goals that are set, which tend to be sort of, oh, I don't know if this is not quite the right way to say it, not so much a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but often it's easier to scale things that have one or a few objectives, not multiple objectives. And the fact that there's a lot going on, there's often simplification or have to be more selective about what can be scaled. Third, like many organizations, scaling is not built in to GIZ project evaluations. And I had the pleasure, and I have to say, they couldn't have been more cooperative or forthcoming, of interviewing both parts of GIZ's evaluation team. There is a team that evaluates individual projects, and there's one that does strategic overviews. And the GIZ, like many bilateral donors, follows the OECD-DAC guidelines. And those guidelines don't really integrate scaling very well. So there's not an attempt to clearly define what specific activities occurred and are core or central to the program. Again, issues of cost. And there's one question on, could this be scaled in the future, but which comes from the DAC guidelines, but there's not a lot of specification on how to evaluate that or what that might look like. And last but not least, despite the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, there's a very strong and ongoing commitment to standardization, and that's something I know that Arlette is working on with other colleagues at GIZ. At the same time, there's a lot of emphasis in GIZ projects that everything has to be new and different and customized and relevant. There isn't, in my opinion, and I think GIZ sees it the same way, necessarily a contradiction between replication or replicability or scalability and relevance, but that has to be looked at harder. I think one of the things I found in my work is that it's often difficult to replicate specific activities, but when you see what the outputs, if you think about it from a logical framework or a results framework point of view, if you think about, well, what are the outputs that need to be replicated, and there could be a whole menu of activities that could achieve those, then those two things, replication and relevance, do align, but that requires a different approach to evaluation. And so the evaluation methodology is not really set up currently for standardization. So I've already sort of highlighted a number of my recommendations. I do think it would be really helpful if GIZ would make explicit what goals are in terms of scaling, whether that's a certain percentage of projects are expected to have follow-up projects, because that would then allow for GIZ to build scaling more into projects from the beginning, especially projects that are perceived as having a likelihood of having a follow-up project. I have to say that one of the reasons that many GIZ projects do go to scale is precisely because the government partners in country are so pleased with the results, or other donors will often approach GIZ and say, hey, this was great. If you want to take this to national scale, we'd be interested in co-funding it. And that seems to happen quite a bit. I think that building scaling in from the beginning would require a little bit better triangulation between what BMZ agrees upon up front and what GIZ has to implement in terms of, so it's not just a question of integrating scaling into GIZ, but also into the negotiations up front of what these projects will contain, and that would include a longer view. And last but not least, I think, as I've mentioned before, integrating not only into the M&E framework, but being a little bit more explicit, even within projects, of how much are we focusing on relevance, sustainability, versus scaling in particular. My experience, and I think this is becoming sort of, it's in the scaling principles for the scaling community of practice, and now becoming much more common, is that scaling needs to think not just about scale, but optimal scale. And optimal scale does include these questions of impact, also other issues like inequality and equity considerations and other trade-offs. And that ultimately the goals for a project or an effort that does target scaling has to be more explicit about the various trade-offs that one makes between multiple objectives, including but not only scale itself. Now, turning to the question of what GIZ can do to support scaling more, and Arlette and Mara's unit in particular, a clear finding, and I've seen this in a number of other organizations, is that staff is just overwhelmed with competing demands on their time. There is now a trend in many development organizations that all projects have to do everything, not only whatever it is in terms of the sector. They might be working like agriculture or health or education, but they need to mainstream gender or climate change, dealing with extreme poverty, youth employment, et cetera, et cetera. And so the GIZ staff I talked to were all feeling overwhelmed by all these competing cross-cutting themes that they have to integrate. And so while they were eager to have input and support from scaling, they were very clear that they didn't want yet another mandate that, in addition to the list that I just gave, scaling is also mandatory. How are you going to integrate scaling, et cetera, et cetera? And so what they were really looking for is that they felt they needed help and they could use help, but they didn't want it to be mandatory. And consequently, given their other competing imperatives that they have to deal with, they wanted it to be as easy for them to do as possible. And particularly where I think the greatest need for scaling support was in the follow-up projects I mentioned, where people, find that, okay, a project's been running for 3 years. By the way, most GIZ projects do only run for 3 years, and that makes scaling an additional challenge. That, okay, this was successful, the government wants to take it to the next level, there are co-funders that want to take it to the next level. There are people now who are mandated within GIZ of how to do that. What kind of support can be provided to work with that and to help follow up projects? And there was a general consensus internally that what would be most effective would be, as Arlette mentioned at the beginning of her comments, that there are these planning advisors who are sort of the colleagues of Arlette's and part of this technical support division, who do both manage the process of designing projects as well as providing follow-up support. And these project advisors could be sort of are the key linchpin or change agent. And if we could get them or provide support to them and training for them, and at least understanding what scaling is and providing them with some simple tools, that would at least get a foot in the door in terms of scaling, getting more explicit consideration in both project design and implementation. And that could be supplemented, as you can see on the slide, with some simple frameworks and tools for scaling. As I said at the beginning of my comments, GIZ already does have a framework and tools, and it's actually pretty good. In my opinion, it needs a little bit of strengthening, particularly, not surprising, it's already very good on issues of sustainability, on issues of political involvement, and making sure all stakeholders are integrated and their considerations are taken into account. But where it could use some more strengthening is particularly on these issues of the trade-offs and building and scaling from the beginning and clear what the constraints are at large scale. And secondly, even if we do build scaling in with the planning advisors, in terms of trying to get scaling a bit integrated from the very beginning, they clearly don't have the bandwidth, being already overwhelmed with many or have a lot of work to do with the many competing demands they're addressing to really support projects on an ongoing basis. And the second recommendation would be to put together a roster of experts, whether internal or external, that could really accompany projects to scale. I was really pleased with the number of people I talked to who have scaled projects at GIZ, have a very sophisticated knowledge of how scaling works and what needs to be done. And so I think there already exists a substantial in-house capacity, and obviously putting together that could be complemented with external consultants. A couple of the global projects I talked to did want to have sort of a scaling person full-time, or at least on a regular basis, monthly or quarterly, that could provide feedback and advice in both developing a scaling strategy. So I think there's a perception, there's a need, there is some demand. They've gone a long way already in developing tools, and I think there's some clear next steps, both in terms of integrating scaling into projects, providing support, and also integrating scaling into their evaluation framework. And I'll just close by saying that the community of practice and part of our mainstreaming scaling effort is working with the evaluation team at the DAC and possibly upgrading or revising the guidelines or providing an addendum that would provide some guidance on scaling. And thanks to the efforts of Mara and Arlette, they have asked me to speak to the evaluation team at GIZ about what types of evaluations could help promote scaling. So I think we're already headed in the right direction, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. That was great and really very complete and comprehensive review of GIZ's scaling approach to date and some interesting recommendations. By the way, we already have a lot of very helpful comments and interesting comments in this chat. Let's hold off on answering them. Richard, if you want to answer some directly in the chat, by all means, go ahead. but also you may want to just listen to the conversation that's unfolding here among the panelists. But let me go back to Arlette for just a moment then. So you've come up, Richard, with a bunch of recommendations, well, analysis and then recommendations. So I guess the natural question to you, Arlette, is, so what are you going to do with those? What's the next step? And look, I know this is incredibly difficult. I mean, look, I've worked with probably 10, 20 funders over the last 15, 20 years on scaling. And for example, EFAT, we worked with EFAT for 6, 7 years and building up. They built up a tremendous approach, systematic approach to scaling. Then it kind of fell in disrepair. Just this morning, I learned that they're restarting the engine on scaling. So I'd be very interested to see what's happening. But this doesn't come natural. And actually, one of the questions you might think of, we might all think about, is why is it so hard to get funder organizations to actually take this seriously into their day-to-day operational practice? But before we go there, Arlette, what next in GIZ, given that analysis that you and Richard and Mara have carried out? Go ahead.
But maybe to pick up on that comment that you just made, because I think there are two big framework conditions that I see that are really, influencing what we are trying to do. I mean, one is this issue of competing interests that Richard also mentioned. Like, we're not just talking about scaling. There is equity, gender mainstreaming, leave no one behind. There is a multitude of topics where we say, okay, we really need to make a difference here. And the second one for us as organization is really this, that we are currently still very much designed as a project-based organization and getting contracted for the implementation of a specific project that runs for 3 years in most cases, as Richard said. So, within that sphere, we have to try now to see how we are going forward. And as Johannes mentioned, it's I think it's work in progress. But what we are looking at are basically two avenues. One is really, and also looking at who are we as a unit in the organization and what can be influenced directly and what is, where do we have to lobby to actually create changes. And the one area or one avenue more on a working level really that I also see is this whole question around capacity development of what we call planning officers, and concretely really to make this trade-off that Richard was mentioning much more transparent. That relevance is really great, but if relevance, we should look at what is the optimum balance between all the 4 factors and not just relevance. Because if you have I don't know if somebody was asking for an example in the chat, but it basically means if I work with one hospital or one municipality and, I'm creating the greatest program for them, that's great, but it cannot be scaled in the same way to another 1,000. So, what's the, I think somebody mentioned the golden toilet seat. That's not what we want. We want something that it can be scaled. So this trade-off is one avenue. And the second one, or actually part of that also, the continuous work with the evaluation unit to see if we can change also incentive structures in context of evaluation. What is getting recognized and what is also internally, what's the narrative around success? So that's one part. And sorry, Johannes, if I'm too long. And the second one is more on a strategic level. I mean, the situation that changes for us is we have a new, actually starting next month, we have a new corporate strategy that for the first time says that GIZ as an organization would like to go beyond being an implementer of individual projects, but become an organization that is delivering integrated solutions that directly address global challenges. So for you, that might sound quite normal, but for us, it's really a mindset shift to go away from saying, you know, this is project A, we are getting contracted and that's what we do, but saying, you know, we are looking at integrated solutions. And in that context comes for us this these considerations of using standardization in a stronger way. And I've seen a few questions in the chat. So, and maybe Johannes, just to address that quickly. The intention is not to say, you know, we have now cookie cutter projects and everything has to look the same everywhere. And that's our understanding of standardization, but rather, you know, let's take the example of sanitation. How do you provide sanitation? We have big projects, you know, around the world. And the idea of standardization is to say, within that topic, what are building blocks that can be reused, where we are saying, you know, not every project has to reinvent the wheel, but what can be replicated. And this so basically it's very much scaling in the sense of replication. And the idea is that it becomes one part of a project. So, you know, you have this replicable building block, and then around, you know, the more context relevant activities, and all together, you know, and with the whole package, you still have a project that is relevant. But maybe, Johannes, I stop here, and you see it's an ongoing conversation.
That's great. No, I mean, I think you focused on 3 areas in particular: the sort of the capacity development for planning officers, focusing more on the trade-offs and evaluation, and a few other things. So you've got your plate full in dealing with a number of these issues, and we all wish you well. And you know, maybe the conversations that we're having actually already today, including with representatives from other funders, such as Erin, who has had a lot of comments in the chat. Those cross conversations with other funders can actually be hopefully very helpful to all of you in sort of figuring out how best to move forward. Now, that brings me over to the next sort of stakeholder in this business, and that, of course, are the recipients. Those are the, you know, who you're working with on the ground. And so I'm very happy to see Vishnu Gautam with us today. And Vishnu, you know, I have a couple of questions for you. And so from your perspective in Nepal, having worked with GIZ and other funders in the past, so what have you seen in terms of GIZ's participation, support for scaling initiatives in Nepal? Has GIZ supported them, or maybe sometimes acted as a constraint on, you know, continuity, replication, scaling of something that was successful? And if you have some examples that you can share with us, so much the better. And indeed, if you have any suggestions for GIZ to sort of help them help you better, then that would be great. So thanks so much for being with us, Vishnu. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonas. It's really a great pleasure to me for being a part of this valuable webinar, because this is a kind of very new and interesting area to be discussed. As you said, GIZ is working in Nepal for a long time. My experience working with GIZ, I think it goes around 1998, when I was working as a CEO of one of the municipality of Nepal, where the GIZ technical support was there. Basically, GIZ technical support to Nepal is in various sectors, like heritage conservation, health, energy, and so many other sectors, including urban governance. So in urban governance, GIZ technical support, I think we can find good experiences of this scaling of successful project initiations. Many of us may not know that Nepal is a newly federalized country, and as per the constitutions of 2015, Nepal has adopted 3 tiers of government structure. That means the federal and provincial and the local government. So there are 3 tiers structure we have. And as per the constitutional and legal provision of legal provisions, besides the other level of governments, local governments are also entitled to generate on-source revenue through different taxes and fees. So in governance sector, GIZ has providing technical support to the municipalities uh, in different areas, including this solid waste management, urban planning, and effective service delivery, and this improvement of own source revenue of the municipality. So I would like to share today with you the own source revenue improvement initiatives taken by GIZ project, as government of Nepal can share with you as a scaling up initiatives with GIZ project. So GIZ was working only with the 10 partner municipalities, but the initiatives during this project, the GIZ has made impact at that level. So government of Nepal used these initiatives for scaling up to other local government also, because improvement of own source revenue for local government is of a high priority area for the government of Nepal, and it is also a high priority for the local government also, because it will make local governments more self-reliant financially, and at the same time it will reduces the financial burden of the federal government. So government of Nepal seeks support from the development partner agencies to develop and strengthen the support system in improvement of own source revenue. So in this respect, GIZ support was basically focused into the partner municipalities, but these initiations later on government has scaled up to all the local governments. That means we had all 753 local governments right now. So for this, the initiations from government of Nepal was developing a framework guideline, formulating guideline for formulating these revenue improvement initiatives. We call it revenue improvement action plan, and it was piloted at the beginning into the partner municipalities where the GIZ was working, and GIZ used to approach of this technical support using this coaching and mentoring techniques. So later on, government was focusing to use this framework and approach at the same time in its own program for the own source revenue improvement for the local government, as well as make this approach and framework as a mandatory provision to all the development partners who were working working for supporting the local governments in improving their own source revenue. So I think this can be a good example of scaling experiences while working with GIZ. And the provisions of the Constitution, we had National Natural Resource and Fiscal Commission, NNRFC, here in Nepal. And the NNRFC is using this increment, the effort in increment in the on-source revenue as one of the performance indicator of the local government while providing the fiscal equalization grant and the revenue sharing from the federal government to the municipalities. So all these efforts make success this scaling up initiatives. Even it was started with the technical support of the GIZ, but now it is the government of Nepal, basically the Ministry of Federal Affairs and General Administration, used to these initiatives to all the local governments to enhance the own source revenue of the local government. So I think this could be a good example for Nepal to share with all of you. So yeah. Right now, yeah, I'll stop here, and if anything is in question answer session, then I will be happy to contribute more on it. So thank you.
Thank you, Vishnu. That's a great success story, and that would actually be, if you, when we come back in the comment and question session, maybe you could say another word about what you think GIZ did right in actually making this picking up by government easier. The fact that government actually ran with the approach that GIZ had implemented at small scale. Was there anything that GIZ did, or that for that matter the government did, during the implementation of that initial project that facilitated the pickup, that facilitated the replication and the mainstreaming of that idea, if you wish, institutionalization of that idea that GIZ and the government had pursued in that first project to achieve that broader rollout? So if there any particular factor or factors that underpin that success in terms of the handoff, in terms of preparation of the ground and so on, would be very helpful to know. But before we come back to all of the speakers with questions and comments to respond to, let me turn to Ben Kumpf. Now, Ben, from your position in Paris, although you're right now in New York, I know, but from your position at OECD, the DAC in Paris, why are you guys looking at scaling? You know, your role is principally, according to your job description, to worry about innovation. So why do you worry about scaling? But then also, of course, what do you take away from this discussion we've had so far with GIZ, with Vishnu and so on, in terms of what the donor community, bilateral donor community that you're dealing with, but more generally could perhaps learn from this and take forward and maybe address in its own work? Please, Ben.
Thanks, Johannes. So my small team is part of the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, which serves the Development Assistance Committee in tracking official development assistance and setting standards of how it can be accounted for, and supporting DAC members, so bilateral funders, also with substantive advice, not only on innovation, but issues such as environment, gender, governance. And to zoom out, the latest data on ODA, so official development assistance, shows us that in 21 it slightly grew and totaled up to $185.9 billion US. Quite substantial, but at the same time, also triggered by the COVID-19 crisis, the SDG financing gap almost doubled after the pandemic hit and totaled up to about 3.9 trillion. For the first time in decades, extreme poverty grew again, and we are dealing, for example, now again with famines, a phenomenon we thought was an issue of the past. And I highlight these issues to underscore that collectively, we obviously need to do much better on scaling, but simply scaling up good development practice as it exists today will not cut it. Not in light of the massive SDG financing gap, and not in light of the huge transitions that particularly global north countries have to advance in light of the climate and biodiversity crisis, but also middle and low income countries eventually have to think how their economic trajectories in light of net zero requirements will unfold. So in other words, we have to do much better on scaling good development practice, but also acknowledging where our innovation needs. And in addition to this, a much greater strategic clarity is needed on what kind of work has truly potential catalytic effect and in what I call it direction. I know that's jargon, but essentially a strategic reflection on if you think of a social technological system, does this require strengthening? Let's think of a national health system that's well aligned with its paradigms and requires strengthening. Or does it require transformation? And if you think of local or interconnected regional global food systems, that's very often the case as one example. GIZ has done a wonderful work on further framing transformative policy and programming in a great report. And I think that's a really good reference for the donor community to have this greater strategic clarity. So that's the first point. Simply accelerating good development practice and scaling up will not be sufficient. That's the reason why we are looking at the issue of scaling. And the second point is we did a review of the innovation capabilities of the members of the Development Assistance Committee back in 2020. And of course, scaling featured in there with a look to how well are DAC members doing with the whole innovation cycle that sometimes can start with ideation, but it can also just take really good local ideas and help them to better establish a business case and help them to scale. And we found many examples of where innovation played a massively positive role for development outcomes. Think of cash transfers, think of digital banking and digital money systems. But what we found is that essentially only small pockets of certain organizations innovate strategically and scale over time. And broadly, most innovation activities reflect the larger picture. They are budgeted for and supported for too short timeframes. They don't from the get-go have a vision for the appropriate and sustainable scale. And we found in virtually none of the organizations a dedicated scaling strategy or a scaling officer or or clarity within the innovation departments of when a specific investment or effort has reached sufficient maturity and sufficient evidence in the context to be not part of the innovation portfolio anymore, but it's on a transition to scale, which would help immensely with more strategic support. Overall, what's happening in the innovation development world in the DAC members is reflected in the larger programmatic world, which is the assumption that if we, within a 4 or 5 year project, design an intervention that shows positive impact to a certain degree, somebody will pick it up and run with it. Now, I mentioned the positive outliers. We found in a few places really good scaling practices, building on also what Richard said and he found in his research. And to name two, one is the practices around market systems development from a number of donors that really look quite systemically on how can we, with a portfolio of interventions and sometimes also innovation investments, advance the creation of small local markets for pro-poor outcomes. And the other examples were the support for innovations that had a vision for scale through the public sector in relatively stable contexts and country typologies where government partners were involved from the get-go. And very often, what's today often labeled as localization played a massive role, the commitment to involve local partners from the get-go. And it was very often local innovations that were scouted for, found, supported. And this was particularly the case for a lot of work in the health sector. And I just want to give a shout out to example for USAID and Grand Challenges Canada, which now launched a country innovation platform with the Ghanaian health services to do exactly this, look for local innovations and help them scale through the public sector. Now, to finalize this second point, a finding from your community, Johannes, Larry, Richard, which is you have to define your vision for appropriate and sustainable scale from the get-go, be it for an innovation or a program, is something that's very much reflected in our findings on innovation capabilities across the DAC membership and strengths and weaknesses, in this case, well, weakness/area for improvement. And to finalize with a third point quickly, speaking about us at the OECD Development Assistance Committee, we are quite cognizant of, I wouldn't even call it some of the shortcomings that Richard mentioned, because I do think that in our evaluation criteria, scaling and sustainability is incorporated, but as Richard laid out, we are cognizant that there's a certain lack of more guidance and more details that could help entrepreneurs in funder organizations and then trickle down to implementers advanced scaling practices. What we are currently doing together with the OECD EvalNet and the OECD results community is forming a task force to start with a literature review on scaling, look at existing guidance and principles to eventually co-formulate with members of the DAC, either something along the lines of DAC principles or another form that essentially can help with more details change makers in DAC member agencies to advocate for meaningful changes, be it in evaluation practices like Alet laid out, be it in programming and on the larger strategic level of organizations. We link this also to other ongoing work that we are currently doing on behalf of DAC members, particularly on localization, which I mentioned earlier, but also on novel financing instruments. Think of much longer term financing modalities with much more support for experimentation and iteration, which we know is necessary to get something to scale. Scaling frameworks look quite linear, but they are in reality far from being linear. And as we know, rather messy, dependent on investment in personal relationship, alliance and coalition building, to just name a few. So in summary, these 3 points lead us to look closely at scaling as we are after better policies for better lives at the OECD and really interested in making not much more bitter impact at scale, but also with the right strategic clarity on whether we want to strengthen or transform systems. Back to you, Johannes.
Thanks, Ben. That was terrific. And excuse me, I think it just shows that there's so much consistency, let me put it this way, between the work that you've been doing in assessing, coming from the innovation side, of what's happening or not happening in terms of achieving impact at scale from potentially successful innovations, and where we're coming from, which is focusing specifically on scaling process, scaling experience. And I think what's among the consistent findings here is that actually we have a large number, if you add them all up, of really successful scaling experiences. And so the big question to my, while at the same time, all of us have experienced that there's no real systematic focus on sort of linking good innovations with processes to support scaling, to achieve impact at scale, that is absolutely necessary for us to ultimately meet SDGs or Paris climate goals and so on. Now, you also mentioned, of course, that innovation and scaling by themselves probably are not enough, because we also need finance. Clearly, a lot of people stress the big gap in financing, and if we know from our scaling experience that actually lack of financing is one of the biggest constraints in this business. And so clearly finance is important. And finally, we know that to achieve sustainable scale in many cases, system change, policy reform, system change, institutional change, often at a national level, maybe even at a global or regional level, is an important ingredient. So in the end, everything has to sort of come together, which is maybe what explains the difficulty of actually systematically and consistency going for this impact at scale, even though we have many examples. Anyway, I don't want to intervene in the discussion. I should just guide it, if you wish. And so let me now move to a number of the comments that we received, which were very helpful already, I think, in focusing our agenda for the next 20 minutes or so, that we have time before Larry closes us out with some closing comments. So among the comments that I've seen already on the chat, this concept, Richard, of trade-offs is clearly a very important one that you flag. Maybe we haven't focused collectively enough, frankly, in my experience, on as as a reason for why maybe it is tricky to figure out how much and where and how to best scale. So I don't know whether, given the comments, Richard, do you want to say anything more about trade-offs? Of course, it's also was a topic which Arlette came back to in her challenge, explaining a challenge moving forward. So that's one topic. A second one that is pervasive on the chat is sort of projects. So how do we find projects? Short 3 years versus long 10 years, apparently GIZ had in the past, which by the way, I think is fascinating. And it may be worth going back at some point to explore why it was shortened. And now maybe we're talking about longer project periods. And what does that mean for the way we think about projects? I would argue, in fact, we need to think much more fundamentally about how we define our projects and what we define as the results that we want to achieve in projects. So if one or two or more of you can say a bit more about projects. In that connection, there was an interesting comment, I think it was by Peter, on, maybe we should focus more on process innovations and improvements and less on technology as elements of that would support replicability. So maybe that's something to deal with. Scaling tools. Richard, you flagged that we do have some scaling tools, and that created quite a bit of buzz, especially with Leonard and Petronella chiming in, and that's perhaps something we should focus on more explicitly in our work on this mainstreaming initiative. And Leonard, in fact, suggested a tool smash up, or whatever you call it, that we could pursue. But maybe Arlette, you could tell us whether you think that's would be useful contribution to your work in trying to mainstream and get, if you have some clear understanding what's out there in terms of tools that you can then yourselves perhaps look at and evaluate in terms of what might be useful. By the way, we've had a reference to a very good initiative called the Scaling Exchange, which was initiated by IDRC in Canada, and a call to action. And Petronella, I think it was you who raised that. And I'm happy to say that actually our initiative, our mainstream initiative, in part is a reaction to this call for action to donors to focus more explicitly on scaling. And so hopefully through this work, we can actually show some response to the call for action. But we also hope to work in future with some of you who contributed to this call for action. The experience with scaling advisors in GIZ is something worth pursuing. I think maybe Arlette, we could actually look at that, because you have funded scaling advisors in countries or in organizations by the CGIAR. Market systems development, maybe there's something more to be said about that. Why has that been a success? And finally, I guess I come back to the question. So in my experience, if we think and see what's going on, scaling isn't rocket science, but then why is it so difficult to get it systematically into the DNA, into the way of thinking and acting in our funder organizations? Let me stop here. I've raised perhaps too many questions, but let's maybe reverse slightly. Arlette, do you want to start with some comments on sort of what you've heard?
Yeah, sure. There are so many things, and actually, I think we heard even more in the chat, or actually there were, a bigger variety of contributions in the chat. And luckily you summarized it, because I could not manage to at the same time listen and follow the chat. But maybe to jump in on, and your main question, why haven't we still succeeded? I mean, you are the one who is working on this for 20, 30 years. If anybody has the answer, it must be you. But I guess, it's, the answer is it's not simple, and it's not. But coming back to the concrete points of what you raised, maybe to jump in two areas. One is project duration. We really had, when I started in GIZ in 2012, we still had this longer term programs. But that I guess in all of this there are no simple answers. even when we had these longer programs, which of course are a better precondition. If you want to have systematic change, of course we are not going to succeed in 3 years. We need, you know, in our society, in any society, you need a longer time frame. Still, you know, a longer time frame by itself does not mean that the level of ambition that you have in the project is necessarily the scaling ambition. You know, I mean, it's a better framework, but it's not necessarily what I'm trying to say. It's not a guarantee either that we are getting there. So, but yeah, I think where I'm actually placing my hopes, if I can say it like that, is that on a country level, we will be looking more at, you know, what can be also at the country level in terms of programming be looked at. You know, what are the partner priorities and how can several projects contribute? And this is actually where I see, I mean, where I'm hoping that we can make a greater difference. And I very much liked Ben's point now on, you know, it's actually two different things to look at what do we want to scale. I mean, the one element on strengthening, you know, existing systems because we say it makes sense and, you know, should be replicated or built up. And the other one, looking at transformative change, where we, you know, from the beginning have to think differently about how are we solving things. And I think that's a very nice picture of having these two elements side by side. And last comment, then I'm quiet. On the tools mashup, well, I didn't see the term, how it's properly, but I very much like that. And I think we should look into that because, you know, you need a critical mass of people who are passionate about this. And, you know, the more we can bring together, the more lively the whole discussion will be. And maybe the greater the chances that we are, you know, persuading other people to join. Yeah, so I really like it. Back to you.
Thank you, Arlette. I know I'm actually incredibly grateful to you and GIZ that you're willing to kick us off with this event today, because frankly, I think we needed this kind of honest and you know, really taking on the issues as you have in this way that says, look, we don't really have the answers yet, but we're trying hard and we have the energy to do so. So I think this is great because I think that's what we need. I mean, I think there are answers out there. We can find the answers by working together on this. And you know, to my mind, we're on a good path here. So thank you very much. Richard, do you want to pick up some of the issues that, and I saw you already did respond to a couple of them, but maybe you want to quickly pick up one or two of the other ones or the ones that I mentioned. Thank you.
Well, actually, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'd actually like to kick one more back to Arlette, if you're willing, Arlette. And that is the question of standardization, or what I would call documentation, because I know you're intimately involved in efforts to move this forward at GIZ. Maybe I'll just say a word on that and then would love to hear more from you, which is right now my understanding, and I think this is true of almost every donor I've ever worked with, is that if you try to read the project documentation, you would be hard pressed to figure out exactly what was done, what the key activities were, what their impact was. Well, that's not true. You would find out their impact, but it would be hard to know what exactly could be scaled, especially how much it cost, what resources are required to do it, et cetera, et cetera. And without going through all the documentation, and at least the people I interviewed at GIZ said that when they hear about a project that they think, wow, I'm doing something similar in another country, maybe there's something there, and they start to look at the documentation, it's hard to find sort of a short enough version that they don't have to read a 50-page evaluation, but a long enough version that actually has enough to it that they can say, for example, well, a key question, well, how is context dependent, given the emphasis on relevance, was this innovation or this intervention or this project And to what extent is the context where I work similar or different? And what can I learn about that? And I know that finding that balance between creating a knowledge management website or database that's accessible, that's got enough detail that you can find what you want, but not too much detail that you don't have to read 50 pages, is something that GIZ is very much working on. Could you, well, I'll let you say more about that in a second, but I did want to note that in the chat, Mira Mikhalchik mentioned that they have an innovation profiling tool, and I think some of the other toolkits that were discussed in the chat have attempted to do this, but I think this is something that the DAC and the DAC's evaluation guidelines about how do you document innovations or interventions for scale, and especially in terms of the resources they require, the cost they require, what context they work in, where they may or may not be appropriate, how they could be adapted, I think is, I think we have a lot of the building blocks from that, but I don't know of anybody that does that particularly well. So I think that's a real critical issue moving forward. I think to answer your question briefly, Johannes, about why things don't go to scale, I think one of the things we know is that most organizations are committed to being catalytic. But the problem with being catalytic, if you really are catalytic, is you don't have control over what you catalyze. So if your goals are something that can be only met and measured by project end, which is, we reach these many people with this impact, then we can measure it. But if it's to trigger change and larger scaling that's ongoing, that's harder to have accountability for. And most projects emphasize accountability over, as well as the evaluation tools, over learning and generating a follow-up round of triggering catalytic change. Closely related to that, which you mentioned before, is this resource question, but it's not just resources. Well, if you're going to catalyze something, who is being catalyzed? What resource base, what implementer? Is it the national government? Is it market systems, et cetera, et cetera? And there was also a question in the chat, or discussion in the chat, about this question about systems change. Actually, and also maybe Arlette, you could speak to this, my understanding is probably the majority of GIZ projects are more about capacity building and system strengthening within ministries in particular, and less about particular interventions that are services or products that are provided on the ground directly to the population. But my conversations with GIZ staff suggest that those also, even systems change, especially capacity building, faces scaling questions. Well, you can only do so much systems change and capacity building in 3 years. If you want to continue to grow that, scale that nationally, or deepen it, like digitalization is a big emphasis, how do you make sure that that continues? Are there enough digital experts or IT experts in a ministry? Is there the software? Is there the hardware? Are there the human skills to keep that going? So I think we have a bit of a false dichotomy between, sometimes between scaling and systems change, because I think in many cases, scaling for GIZ is in fact scaling of capacity building and systems change. So I would love to hear, if it's okay with you, Johannes, what Arlette's experience is at GIZ on standardization, documentation, and scaling systems change.
Thanks, Richard. Sorry, Arlette, but rather than coming back to you, maybe you're relieved if I don't come back to you, because these are important but maybe difficult questions to answer in 2 or 3 minutes, which is basically what we have. I would like to go back to Bishnu. And Bishnu, if you are still with us, I can't see you right now. Yeah, there you are. If you could turn on your video, and maybe, the question I raised earlier after your presentation, do you have a sort of a minute or two to tell us what particularly did GIZ do right, and the government perhaps do right, in making sure there was this handoff from what GIZ supported in the initial project, and how then the government took over this particular model, this particular approach, and scaled it up? Was there something in this handoff, in this connection between GIZ and the government, that maybe caused the success that you reported on? Thank you, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Johannes. GIZ one technical assistant project through the GIZ support at that time when I was working in Mofaga was capacity development for some national government, CDSC we call it in short form. And I was the counterpart in the ministry for this project. And at the beginning, the GIZ started working with the partner municipalities. Besides the other technical support, the support in OSR was one of the most important area at that time. And for the piloting purpose, we first of all we developed the guideline for the municipalities so that it could be easier to follow the same process for the municipalities for the own source revenue improvement initiatives. We call it revenue improvement action plan. So the guideline was formulated and approved by the government, and the guideline was used in these partner municipalities. And for the technical support to the municipalities, GIZ used to have a mentoring and coaching approach besides of sending the consultant from outside preparing the revenue improvement action plan. The technical support was mainly focused in transferring the skills to the municipal officials so that they can do these kind of things by their own in future. So the technique was using this coaching and mentoring technique was used, and these two things I think create a very good result in that partner municipalities. And later on, this approach and this guideline was used by the government, by Mofaga, for the all local government. And I think as a result, in the year, I think this 18-19, the total own source revenue of the local government in Nepal, that means all 753 local government, they could hardly generated 1,400 million Nepalese rupees. After 2 years, that means it's 2021, fiscal year 2021, it raised up to 2,000 million. So the result was quite exciting. I think the government also using these two techniques and this instrument, that means the guideline till now. So I think this basically these two things were the most important thing that we can take good examples for this. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That is
thank you.
really insightful. I think actually this particular case may be worth writing up because, and particularly the factors that explain the success. So thank you so much for sharing your experience from the ground up, so to speak, here, because we need to bring these topics to life, and the best way to do it is exactly by having experience like yours brought to the table. So thank you. Ben,
Yeah,
I don't know, we're running out of time. Is there anything, one last minute you want to contribute to, sort of as a takeaway before I hand over to Larry and ask him for his takeaways, because we do want to close more or less on time. Ben, any last word of wisdom?
I think Ben may have left us.
Ah, Ben left, okay. So then, Larry, are you still here? Yes, I see you there. So
I am
over
still
to
here.
you. You've
I
been
am
very
still
quiet,
here, and I want to take these.
Uncharacteristically quiet. Go ahead.
I want to take the occasion to really thank the panel for a very, very stimulating conversation. I had thought about the subject before and mapped out what might be some closing remarks, but the truth is almost everything I wanted to say has been said by one or another of you. So I'll close with just 3 points that really struck me vis-a-vis our ongoing work in scaling. The first is that really only governments and markets can take things to scale. So if we're talking about something that will deliver outcomes, services, goods, predictably and sustainably at scale, we're for the most part talking about governments and markets, maybe social enterprise, but I would take that as a variation on markets. So if we're talking about that, we're talking about projects, donor-funded projects, not as something that scales, but that's something that enables one of those two sources to scale. So something that can create a permanent change in one or both of the interaction between those two sources. That was clear in the Nepal case. It's clear in focusing on market systems as a place where things have worked, where somehow someone has managed to figure out an intervention that would make a permanent change in something that delivers goods, services, and outcomes sustainably at scale. I think that's part of the key to unwinding how you get from the numerator, which is what we're doing in the project, to the denominator, which is the scale of the problem, and also how you get from temporary to permanent. Second thing I would say is that the speakers really highlighted the role, use, and limitations of projects. As a donor community, we've really fallen into a project modality. I'm not arguing against that because I think it has major virtues, but it also has some major shortcomings. So unless the view is how the project is being used as an instrument of change, and unless the evaluation is against the extent to which it succeeded at being an instrument of change in that larger system, we're missing the key link, what some people have called the second theory of change, as to how the intervention is going to really result in that sort of long-term differential in the way things are done and the results that are achieved. And finally, I think there's no way out of this set of issues that does not lead straight through the issue of country leadership. The more this is extended from the donor countries to the host country, rather than simply finding its source in the host country and finding a way to enable it, whether those be, again, markets or governments, the less likely it is to succeed, however glorious the objective might be. And again, the examples that people were highlighting, in my opinion, were successful precisely because they identified something that wanted to happen at the local level that was somehow constrained, and they were clever enough to find a way to intervene that helped bring that link together. People intermediated between the problem and the solution. People were focused on the local definition of the problem, and people were focused on what was really possible at the local level institutionally. And that was what made it possible for the donor to not overstate their role, to really see their role as genuinely catalytic, but catalytic to somebody, to come back to that question. So for me, the conversation was very grown up, very adult, and very realistic about what some of the possibilities and results can be on this, but also about the challenges that face donor organizations that at the moment tend to be more stuck in a direct beneficiary, direct project modality than in trying to find and galvanize those sorts of national changes. So thanks again to all of you who are involved.
Thank you, Larry. That was a terrific set of 3 takeaways, which I think are absolutely central. Each of them probably subject to a lot more debate. We already had one comment that markets and governments usually have to intersect and have to work together for successful scaling. So lots more to think about. But those 3 areas that you highlighted were terrific. And so since we're at the end of our 90 minutes, I thank all of you who joined this call. I thank especially our speakers, Arlette, Richard, Vishnu. It's late where you are, so sleep well tonight. I thank you, Ben, although you're already off and running in New York City. I thank everybody who made this possible. I thank Adam and Gabi and Sam at MSI who managed the platform today for us, Teams platform. So thanks everybody, and it's been just wonderful exchange. And we'll be, as I said, have recorded this. We'll put it on the website, and God willing, we'll write up a summary of the key points, because we need to keep track of these debates. It's not helpful, and it's helpful, but it's not really enough to just have a conversation. We really have to extract the gems from the many ideas that we have heard about today. So thanks very much and all the best. See you on the 19th of April when we hear from CRS. Aaron already was very active today in the conversation. So Aaron, thank you for keeping us moving forward, and we'll see you on the 19th of April. All the best, everybody, and thank you so much. Bye-bye.